Hello and welcome to Galbraith Does Psych. I'm Galbraith, and I'm here today to talk to you about the Asch Conformity study. Quite excited about this one actually. I quite like this study, but also this is the first video that I'm recording for this channel, and so yeah, pretty happy about that. Let's give it a go. So just a quick rundown then. You're probably aware of this one already, but this is the one where the participants came and sat in a room with some people they didn't know, and they had to do what Asch described as a visual discrimination or visual acuity task. So they were told basically it was a vision test, and they had to, if you remember, match the lines to the one on the left as you can see it. So which one is the same length? And of course you can see it's line A. But the Confederates, the people, on the side of the experimenter, actors, didn't say that. They gave the wrong answer. For example, they went down the line saying B, 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 and it got to the naive participant, because they didn't know that it was, a setup. And they're thinking, oh, okay, well, I thought it was A, but if everyone else is going to say B, and on the whole they did say B, or whatever the rest of the group said. So it was a study of normative social influence, where we know the answer, but we just don't want to stick out. And that was confirmed in interviews afterwards that Asch ran with the participants as part of the debrief process. Just a couple of headline findings, just because it is a key study, so quick recap. Around a third was the overall or average conformity rate. Depends on the book you look in, but 36.8 is a slightly more specific figure for you. 5% of participants conformed every time, and 25% never conformed. He ran a condition, it was a control condition, just to test the task really, without any Confederates in it, and participants were over 99% accurate in that control task, which again tells us that it was indeed normative influence. They did know the answer, they just didn't want to stick out. Okay, so that's a brief rundown of the Asch study. But I'm here really to give you my thoughts on it, to talk about things like the internal validity, external validity, ethics, to kind of help you evaluate it. And we're going to present this as a bit of a review, just to up a little bit, make it a little bit more interesting. So firstly, we're going to talk about the internal validity of this study. You might like to have a little think for yourself about what is your opinion on the internal validity of this study. And internal validity, remember, is about how genuine are the findings, how genuine is the setup, how much did the participants behave in a realistic, genuine way. And it's also about things like, can we control variables, all that sort of thing. So my first thought is that this was done in controlled conditions. It was a lab setup, which means we're controlling extraneous variables, things like the location, the timings, the stimulus, noise levels, all of this was carefully controlled, so we can be more certain of the internal validity of the conclusions that Asch drew about conformity. So I think that's a plus. Linked to this is the idea of a standardized procedure. Standardized just means that everybody had the same conditions, the same setup. There was a script, basically, that he followed, and the acting was all planned out. And that's good, because we know then that the participants aren't kind of responding to individual differences in the acting or in the setup. Yeah, so everyone's had the same procedure. But it does, of course, rely on the acting ability of the Confederates, and other people have criticised it. How believable is that setup? And if the participants thought that something was a bit off, if they've seen through the Confederates acting, that might well pose the risk of demand characteristics. And if there are demand characteristics, then they're not behaving genuinely, therefore the study might not have internal validity after all. Linked to this idea is the artificial setup. So it's good that it was controlled, but because it was so controlled, because it was in a lab, because it was artificial, Does that encourage the participants to ask questions about how genuine it all is? And if that's the case, again, there's a risk of demand characteristics. Are they just going along with it because they know they're in a study? With all that said, there was a study done in Japan by researchers Mori and Arai. This was much more recent, only about 10 years ago or so, and they basically did the Asch study but with no Confederates. And they did that by using these special glasses that filtered what the participants saw. So all of them apart from one saw the lines as normal, but for one of them, their vision was actually skewed, so they saw the lines differently, and therefore there was a different correct answer. So there was no acting needed. One of them genuinely had a different answer. And guess what? They actually got very similar results to what Asch did originally. So this kind of supports Asch's study. I know it's it's different time, different setting, different people, but it got around the Confederate acting issue and still found similar results. So perhaps that's actually in favour of Asch. If we hadn't talked about this study by Mori and Arai, I would be scoring the internal validity relatively low. But that, I think, brings it back up a bit. And so overall, I'm going to give Asch a 7 out of 10 on internal validity. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about external validity. So external validity, remember, is about how the study can kind of be generalised or understood outside of its original context. So we're going to be talking about things like ecological validity, so that's about does it generalise to other settings or environments. We're going to be talking about temporal validity, which you might know as historical validity, and that's about does it generalise to other times, so does it still apply today? And we're going to be talking about population validity, so does it apply to other people and, for example, other cultures? So, firstly, it was an artificial task. Ask yourself, how often have you been in an environment like the Asch study in your everyday life? Probably never, unless you've done it as a demo in a psychology lesson. So, what does this lead us to question? Well, if it's an artificial setup in an artificial condition, does it really tell us much about conformity in an everyday setting, an everyday environment? Well, therefore that's an ecological validity problem. And I've touched on this already, but not only the task, which you might say lacked mundane realism, might be a good term, it's not an everyday task, not only did that lack ecological validity, but the environment itself lacks ecological validity. They were in a controlled, kind of sterile lab environment with people that they'd never met before. And of course, in our everyday lives, mostly we're around people that we know, so we might act differently in real life. Again, this challenges the ecological validity and therefore the external validity of Asch's study. His study used American males. Well, why might that be a problem? It's only a problem if we think that females might behave differently. So let's ask ourselves, do males and females possibly differ in terms of how they interact with other people in a social context? Well, actually, yes, they probably do, because females might well be a little bit more conformist. And perhaps that's a slightly kind of stereotypical view, but I think if you look at the evidence, look at some data, I think on average you'd probably find that females are indeed slightly more conformist than males. America, as well, is quite an independent culture. Yeah, it's quite a historical idea now, but it's seen as an individualist culture. So it's a culture where kind of everybody's out for themselves, as opposed to kind of being more group orientated. So would a different culture behave differently? Probably. So therefore, if we think that those are genuine issues, then we have to question the population validity of Asch's work. 1950s context. So 1950s America was actually quite a conformist place. There was a big kind of anti-communist movement and pro-kind of America, pro-conformist movement, sometimes known as McCarthyism. And so the question is the social historical context different enough in the 1950s to mean that these findings probably wouldn't happen today? And on balance, probably yes. So we would challenge the historical or temporal validity and say that it might not apply today. And indeed, this is backed by evidence. So Perrin and Spencer in the 1980s did an Asch-style replication with the lines using science and engineering students in the UK. And actually, out of 396 trials, conformity, just one trial out of almost 400. So this massively challenges that overall conformity rate of around a third or just over a third that Asch found. Yes, different people, different backgrounds. They were engineering students, so they're probably a bit more confident with this sort of task, less likely to doubt themselves. But it could also be that it just doesn't seem to apply in today's world. Well, the 1980s, maybe not today's world, is it? But it's certainly in a different time context to the 1950s. And yet, the Mori-Arai replication, 2010 or 2012, this one was, yes, it was Japan. But in a way, that possibly suggests that there is a bit of population validity, a bit of kind of cross-cultural application there. And again, being much more recent, maybe there is something there. So it leaves us in a position where maybe we're not that sure about the population validity and the historical or temporal validity. We're not overly convinced because it is only the one study there we've got, the Mori and Arai one, but there's a little something there. So it's not going to score as low as perhaps it could have done. And overall, I give it, it's still not great, but I give it 4 out of 10 for external validity. The next issue we're going to talk about is ethics. And this is not a particularly bad one, I think, but some thoughts. Deception is an ethical issue here. They were told, remember, that it is a visual discrimination task or a vision test. Of course it wasn't. It was a conformity study. But you can kind of see why that was necessary. If he told them it was a conformity study, obviously it's not going to be worth running at that point because of demand characteristics. Protection from harm. Was there any physical harm? Well, no, there wasn't. He looked after them enough. Was there psychological harm, though? Some people would say no, but for some of the participants, it was probably a bit embarrassing or even a little distressing to kind of question yourself and maybe, be made to feel uncomfortable about sticking out and giving a different answer. So I don't think it's a massive issue, but it is a relevant issue for this study, protection from psychological harm. Did they have the right to withdraw? Yes, they did. No issues there. Asch never pressured anybody to stay that we're aware of. Confidentiality, again, we're not aware of any issues here, so he's stuck by what he needed to do there. He's not published names of participants or any personal data or anything like that. He debriefed his participants, so that was part of the interviews afterwards that I mentioned earlier on. So there's lots of good things there. And overall, Asch gets an 8 out of 10 from me in terms of ethics. Applications. Where are we going with this? Well, I think there's something here in terms of understanding peer pressure and the factors that affect whether or not we conform to a group. His later research, where he looked at different variables, the variations that he did, looking at things like group size, task difficulty, unanimity, that tells us a little bit about our behaviour in terms of how we respond to majority influence, how we respond to peer pressure, and the factors, I suppose, that kind of encourage or discourage that. But, again, in real life, I mentioned this one earlier, but we're around people that we know normally, and these people in this study didn't know each other. They're never going to see each other again. So is it really even peer pressure if we don't know them and we don't really care about what they think and there's no consequences for this? And this comes back really to the issue of ecological validity that we talked about earlier. Again, it's an artificial task as well. So it's not something that you would be particularly worried about getting right or wrong probably, or something that you would really need to kind of look to others for. So does it tell us about real life behaviour or not? Possibly not. And therefore there's probably quite limited real world applications. And I'm sorry, Asch, because I do like your work, but it's going to have to be a 2 out of 10 from me. The final category is exam value. Is it actually worth you learning this? And the short answer is yes, definitely. It's a key study, which means you could have anything up to an essay question on the work of Asch. And in terms of AQA, that means a possible 16 marker. I can hear the sharp intake of breath. He's also got the work on variables affecting conformity that I mentioned a second ago. So the group size, task difficulty, unanimity, all of that. And you can be asked specific questions about any of those. So yes, definitely, this is one worth knowing in depth. It's also useful to support the concept of normative social influence. This is a nice piece of evidence in favour of that theory that you probably learnt before you did Asch, but go back to your notes, use this study to support it. And again with informational influence, so where we conform because we don't know the answer. The task difficulty variation that Asch did, use that to support the concept of informational social influence. It's also relevant in situational explanations for resistance. So when you get to that bit in the social influence topic, one of the things that you're going to talk about is the role of social support. So having an ally that gives us confidence to break the unanimity of the majority. Well, that's exactly what Asch was researching in his unanimity variation when he did the variables affecting conformity. So there's loads of really good reasons to know this study in depth, and therefore Asch gets, it's a whopping 10 out of 10 in terms of value for me. Where does this leave us? The final verdict. Internal validity, we said, was a 7. External validity, a 4. Ethics, an 8. Applications, 2. Sorry, Asch. Value was 10 out of 10. You know how to find the mean. It gives us a score for Asch of 6.2 from Galbraith does Psych. Thanks, Asch. Well, let's see how all this goes, eh? If you like this sort of thing, you can get involved in pressing buttons if that's up your street. What would be interesting though is if you want to get involved in a bit of a discussion about this, let me know your views in the comments section, and I'll do my best to look out and try to get involved as well. Thank you very much. I hope to see you soon in another video. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.